Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another Brotato tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're going to be covering every enemy in Brotato and ranking them on a tier list, as well as talking about how to fight them to give you the tools to face all of these enemies. I think going through each enemy in sort of a systematic way, talking about how it behaves, what's important to think about it, is actually going to be very useful, especially for a lot of new players. So this is a guide that I've been meaning to do for a while, and I'm excited to get to it. I will be covering definitely at least all the basic aliens today. We'll see how we're doing on time then. I might save the elites for a future video, but as you can see here, I've organized the enemies into the order in which they appear on Danger 5, so we'll be talking about them in the order that you will face them during the game. If you're playing on lower difficulties, some of these enemies may not appear or may appear in different orders, but this is how they appear on Danger 5. For the categories that I'm going to be rating them in, I'm going to be rating them basically on how much of your attention they take up. So that is a combination of things. One is, of course, how threatening are they? So some enemies are extremely threatening, and you have to pay a lot of attention to them in order to not die. Another is how rewarding are they? Certain enemies have better drop rates than other enemies, and so they become really important when you see them on the field. I will also, when we get to the elite, be rating them against one another, not against the normal enemies, because obviously the elite takes up all of your attention anytime an elite appears, so these would all be S tier by default, but we'll be rating those against one another rather than against the standard enemies, just to make it a little easier to think about the elites. I will be going through and mentioning the names by which I usually refer to them in my videos, as well as the names they're called on the wiki. That will just make it a little easier. And if you want to pull up exact stats for these guys, you can check the wiki. It's extremely helpful. Brotato has one of the best wikis out there. Huge shout out to the people who do all the work to maintain it. And that will have all of the exact stats. I'll talk about what they do and how they behave, but I'm not going to pull up stats just because I think that would really break up the flow of the video. Alright, let's get right into it. We are talking, first up, starting in Wave 1, about the basic alien, or baby alien on the wiki. At level 1, these guys have 4 health, which means that you have some interesting challenges with certain weapons to kill them. Most notably, something that applies fire but doesn't do damage won't actually... they have 5 health at level 1. So something that applies fire, dealing 1 damage, and then ticks that fire damage for 3 will deal 4 damage, not actually killing them. So anything that does 5 or more damage will one-shot them, but anything that does 4 or less will take 2 shots. That can be important to know for the first wave. Obviously, these guys are there to sort of introduce you to the game. They walk very slowly towards you, and it's very rare that you actually get hit by them if you are dodging once you have a little bit of experience. In numbers, they can be dangerous, but these are a very classic C-tier enemy. We never need to pay too much attention to where these are on the field. The only reason they might rate a little higher is that they're the only thing on the field, Wave 1, of course, so you need to pay attention to them just to try to maximize your Wave 1 farm. So I'm actually talking myself around. I think we're going to put them in B tier just because the waves that they show up, they are often very important, because you have to pay attention to where they are in the first wave in order to maximize your Wave 1 farm. Next up, we've got these little runners, or chasers, which is the name they're called on the wiki. They spawn in groups, and they run quite quickly, and they run directly towards you. Much like the basic aliens, they will chase you down and always move directly towards the player. They have very low health, but do spawn in groups, which means they're more dangerous for ranged characters than for melee characters. They also have an interesting little bonus, which is that compared to the basic aliens, which have a 1% base chance to drop a consumable, these guys have a 2% base chance to drop a consumable, so they're twice as likely to. And if they do drop a consumable, that consumable has a 3% rather than a 1% chance of being a crate. This means that these guys actually, once you get some luck, are one of the better sources of crates on the map, and as such, I think there's something you should kind of pay attention to. You want to clear them out both because they're fast, they can chase you down, and because they will drop crates. So you should be looking for pockets of these guys and clearing them so that more of them spawn, thus maximizing your chance of dropping consumables in crates. For that reason, I'm going to put these also in B tier. The loot aliens, of course, you can probably guess where these are going. They have a 100% chance to drop a crate, so they have a 100% chance to drop a consumable and a 100% chance for that consumable to be a crate. They will sort of wander around the outside of the map. They try to maintain your spacing, try to maintain spacing from you, but anecdotally, at least, I have seen that they will also, if they've been on the map for a long time, try to cross through the middle of it. I think basically just to give the player a chance to hit them if they've been stuck to one point for a really long time. They mostly move randomly, but they do seem to have a tendency to switch sides of the arena occasionally, which gives you a chance to chase them down and kill them. Obviously, when these show up, they're the only thing you should be paying attention to. They absorb a lot of damage because they're very high health, which means they can actually put you under some pressure. They first start appearing in Wave 3, and how the spawn works for loot aliens is that they can spawn at 25 seconds into a wave and every 15 seconds thereafter. So they can spawn at 25 seconds in, at 40 seconds in, at 55 seconds in. If one spawns in wave 3, Wave 3 is only 30 seconds long. So that means that if one spawns in Wave 3, you're only going to have 5 seconds to kill it. Most builds at that point will not be able to kill it, so often in Wave 3, you're better off just focusing on clearing other enemies rather than spending your last 5 seconds of your wave futilely punching the giant bag of health that is a loot alien. But any other time it appears, you're going to have long enough that you definitely want to focus it down. It's extremely valuable and, of course, key to winning lots of runs. They are also a guaranteed source of healing, which is very important, so obviously these are S tier. The Spitter. So I will call these shooters, the wikis will call them spitters. Both of these are basically the same. They move very slowly, but they try to maintain a spacing from the player. And they will move away from you. They'll move towards you if they're too far, and they'll move away from you if you get too close to them. I think that the space they try to maintain is about 300 units, because they will sit just outside of spear range, but within most gun range, which makes them a little harder for melee characters to deal with than ranged characters. So that's just something to keep in mind. These are actually quite valuable for two reasons. One, they fire a projectile that moves pretty quickly, which means that if enough of them build up, you can actually be put under quite a lot of pressure and have to spend a lot of time trying to dodge. And the other is that they have a very good drop rate for an early enemy. They have a 3% consumable drop rate, so triple what a basic alien has. And if they do drop a consumable, they have a 10% chance for that consumable to be a crate. This means this is one of the best ways for you to generate crates, starting at Wave 4, when these first start appearing, is to hunt down and kill these shooters, because they have a pretty high default chance to drop a crate. I mean, it's only 0.3%, but you're killing a lot of them, so that adds up pretty quickly, and of course that's modified by your luck, so it's very worth hunting these down and taking them out in order to try to generate crates, as well as to keep yourself from being under pressure. I think these belong very solidly in A tier. You will definitely want to note the locations of them on the map, but it's not like drop everything and pay attention to what they're doing. All right, the Floater, or the wiki refers to these as fly. They will move slowly, and they will try to orbit around you at a distance. So they will try to maintain an exact spacing from you, and they will move around you pretty slowly, orbiting you. They will never come directly at you, so you're not in danger of them chasing you down, but the big thing that these guys do is they have pretty good health for the level that they start appearing on, so they're relatively hard to kill, and every time you hit them with a ranged weapon, they spawn a projectile. These are extremely dangerous for rapid-firing weapons like the submachine gun because you need lots of shots to kill them since they're fairly high health, and ranged weapons will make them spit tons of projectiles at you. This is the first one where I think there is a really big difference between how you have to pay attention to them as a ranged character and as a melee character. So I'm actually going to duplicate this, I think. I think what we'll do is I'm just going to put them in A tier because you really have to pay attention to where they are as a ranged character, but you can safely just bear in mind that you can safely ignore these guys as a melee character. So for melee characters, they show up in C tier, but for ranged characters, they're A tier. Or even with some weapon sets, they're in S tier. These floaters do have quite a large variance in how much attention you have to pay to them, but basically, if you're submachine guns, they're in S. If you're any other ranged weapon, they're in A, and if you're a melee weapon, then they're in C. So overall, I think A is a good spot to place them in. All right. Next up, we've got the helmet guys. The wiki also calls these helmet guys, or helmet aliens, so we're in agreement there. One thing that's funny about Brotato is just that there are no official names for the monsters, so everybody makes up their own names. I'm giving you both sets of names, both because because one is what you'll see if you look it up on the wiki or in a lot of other guides, and the other is what you'll hear me talk about over the course of hundreds of hours of video, so it can be worth having both names in mind. These guys chase you and they move relatively slowly, so they're not super dangerous. They are pretty high health, but they're also very susceptible to knockback. You can punt them away. Something that is interesting about certain enemies is that they have different levels of susceptibility to knockback. So, for example, loot aliens you can knock back very easily, ribcage aliens you can knock back very easily, but chargers, when they're charging, you can't knock back at all. Tentacles are very hard to knock back. So the helmet aliens being knockbackable, moving very slowly, yes, they have more health than the basic aliens, but they don't behave any differently, and they're just not super dangerous. I think you can almost always safely ignore what these guys are doing and just trust that your weapons will kill them without you really looking at what's going on there. Alright, then we've got the rushers. These are called chargers on the wiki, so they will chase you around, trying to just make contact with you, sort of the same behavior that that all three of the bottom tier of aliens events, I guess. Turns out that just charging straight at you is not the most dangerous behavior for an alien. I think that's something that's kind of interesting that we've already learned just by looking at this tier list. The enemies that charge straight at you tend to just get taken care of by your weapons, whereas ones that have other more difficult to predict or other weird effects on the game state are actually more dangerous than the ones that are just trying to hunt you down. But these guys will, once they've gotten close to you, stop for a moment, gear up, and then charge at you. During this charge, they can't be knocked back at all, and they move very quickly directly towards you. They're also especially dangerous around the edges of the arena because the charge distance seems to reset sometimes when they hit the edge of the arena, which means that they can slide often along the entire edge of the arena, chasing you down the whole way. So you want, if you're near the edge of the map, you want to avoid fighting these guys directly and move back out into the middle of the map to dodge them rather than try to run directly away from them, because they will catch you. And this goes for every enemy that has a charge. They can all sort of hockey slide along the boards, for a very Canadian analogy for you, and hit you as they are following the edge of the boards. I think there's a scene in Black Hawk Down where the guy is telling the rookie to stay away from the walls of an alleyway because bullets follow the walls. It's the same principle here. You want to be away from the walls against these guys because they will follow along the walls, and you will need to step out from that area in order to avoid them. These guys are pretty dangerous, and it's only their relatively low health that saves you from them. The charge cooldown is pretty short, so they're going to keep charging until you kill them. So it's very worth hunting them down because they take up a lot of your attention. I'm going to put these guys in B tier just because they die pretty quickly. But then their buddies who have more health, the horned chargers, they are more dangerous because they have just more health. Which means that they will often be able to hit you with a charge before your weapons kill them. Often the play pattern against the rushers that have no horns, the unarmored ones, is just to let them charge at you and then trust that your weapons will take them out before they land. Against these guys at this level, that almost never works. So you need to be able to actually make sure you're dodging these rather than relying on your weapon damage to see you through. So for that reason, these guys are going to be A tier. Another enemy with a very similar play pattern, these guys start showing up around 8. Here we've got the big chargers, which the wiki calls bruisers. That's interesting. I think these are definitely chargers. But bruisers, I guess, is an okay word for them. Basically, these have exactly the same behavior as the smaller versions, but they are heavier, bigger, and do way more damage. These do extremely high damage scaling for the level that they're on, especially the armored versions, and so they're extremely important to pay attention to. They also will absorb a lot of damage because they have very high health, and so they can prevent you from wave clearing effectively. They give you... Oh wait, did I? Yeah, I reversed these. Okay, these should actually not show up until wave 8, but that's okay. We'll just group them here anyways because they're the same behavior as the smaller ones, but I did mess up the order of these enemies, so I assume people have been yelling at me in the comments about that, and thank you for pointing that out. But we caught it eventually. Alright, anyways, starting at wave 8, these guys will show up. They'll evince the same behavior as the other chargers, but they have way more health and do way more damage for the level. They also make it very difficult to clear certain other high-value enemies, so as a result, we are going to place them in A tier and in S tier, respectively. The armored chargers are the things you really have to pay attention to most throughout basically the whole mid-game, which is also the hardest point of the game. Where they are on the map determines where you are able to play, and so that makes a significant difference in how you can approach the game. Alright, let's jump backwards to wave 7, because I did mess up the order a little bit. We've got the healer. So the healer will zip around, and they will actually... It's one of the only enemies that has behavior... movement behavior that doesn't care what the player is doing. It instead cares about what the other aliens are doing. It tries to find a nearby alien, and it tries to orbit it. Much like the fly orbits the player, these guys will try to orbit enemies. And while they do, they are going to heal by an enormous amount every wave. So basically, they're going to heal enemies to full health for most of the time that they're there, every time it ticks. I'm not actually certain how frequently the healing ticks, but it's pretty frequently. So if you're a character that does chip damage, i.e. something like an elemental build, you really want to hunt these down. If you do burst damage and are just clearing enemies before the healing ticks, you can safely ignore them. So much like the floater, this is another enemy type that really changes depending on what sort of build you are. So if you do like slow over time damage, elemental builds with fire, or engineering builds in particular come to mind, then you're going to need to hunt down the healer, or it's going to stop your damage from going off. If you are a burst damage build with like precise weapons or just high damage melee weapons, or even something like a submachine gun that just has very low time to kill, then you are going to be able to safely ignore these. I think overall you mostly don't need to pay attention to them, so we're going to put them in B tier. Alright, then we've got the eggs. So, also showing up first in Wave 7 are these eggs. They will spawn on the map, and after a little while, they are going to hatch one of these big slashers. I think these are probably the units that I spend the most time talking about in my videos in total. Because every time you get to wave 7, you have to make the decision, am I a character that breaks the eggs, or tries to let them hatch and then kill the slashers that come out of them? The reason for this is that the slashers drop 3 materials on death, and also have a higher chance of dropping consumables, and those consumables have a higher chance of dropping crates, I believe. Oh no, I'm confirming that on the wiki. They don't actually have better chance of consumables, but they drop 3 materials on death. That means that if you can clear them quickly, it is more valuable to you to let the slasher spawn, let the egg hatch, and then kill the slasher. But if you can't kill them quickly, then the slashers, with their enormous health pools and very dangerous attacks, are going to put a real crimp in your style for all of Wave 7. And so it's very important to understand going into Wave 7 how much damage you have relative to the health of the slashers, and whether you can afford to spend some attacks on killing them, or whether you need to avoid letting them spawn and kill the eggs before they hatch. Overall, I think these are, even despite that decision, I don't think I would put them in S tier, because Wave 7 you have to pay attention to them, but in later waves your damage is just going to outscale them, and you won't have the same luxury of paying attention to what they're doing as you will in earlier waves. So I think that what you really want to do in terms of these units is make that one decision when you get to Wave 7, and then other than that, you can pretty safely ignore these. I'm going to put them in B tier. I'll put the eggs in B tier, but if you let the slasher spawn, you really have to pay attention to it. So once the slasher has spawned, it's going to go in A tier, because that's one that you really do need to know where it is and what it's doing. Alright, let's look at the little fin guys. So the fins are another enemy that just chases you around and deals damage on touch. They have very low health, although more health than their weaker brethren. And just like them, they are particularly rewarding, with a 2% consumable drop rate and a 3% crate drop rate if dropping a consumable. These start to spawn at Wave 9, and Wave 9 is the farming wave, where you really want to be able to clear as many of these guys as possible. All that being said, when they actually spawn on the map, you don't need to pay attention to what they're doing. In Wave 9, the only thing that really matters to pay attention to is what the armored chargers are doing. Those are going to be the thing that actually gets you on Wave 9. And in waves after that, you can safely ignore these guys completely, because your damage will just have outscaled what they're doing. So even though I mentioned that these guys are sort of important to pay attention to because of the waves that they spawn, I'm actually going to put their stronger buddies down in C tier, because you almost never need to know actually what these units are up to. In Wave 9, there's so many of them that tracking individual ones also isn't that valuable, and you just have more important things to pay attention to, and in future waves, they represent so little threat that you just don't need to track what they're doing at all. Alright, next up, the rib cages. What does the wiki call these guys? The wiki calls them the Pursuer. So these guys start out slow, but are very, very high health, and every second they get faster. So if you don't have the damage to clear them, or enough knockback to keep pushing them away consistently, they are guaranteed to catch up to you and do damage. And they do a lot of damage. So these guys are pretty dangerous once they actually catch up to you. That being said, most builds by the time they get to Wave 11, where these start spawning, are going to either have the damage to clear the rib cages or the knockback to push them away. It's a rare build that will have to pay a ton of attention to what these are doing. Now, you do have to not walk into them, but because they run straight at you, they pursue you, hence the wiki's name, I suppose, they will usually be behind your direction of movement, because they just try to take the shortest path to you, which naturally means that they end up behind you as you continue to move past them. That's one reason why, again, all of these enemies that just path directly at you are not as dangerous as the enemies with other behaviors, because they will naturally end up behind your direction of movement. The Pursuers will speed up, so they'll eventually hit you, but most builds are going to either have the damage or the knockback to clear them. There are some versions of some builds that are just going to not have the damage to do so. I played one relatively recently in one of my random runs, but I think the chance that the rib cages are what ends your run is usually pretty low. And most of the time, you can just keep moving in a direction and ignore what these are doing because they're going to show up behind you and your weapons will take care of them before they reach you. For that reason, I'm going to, I think probably somewhat controversially, place these in C tier because I just think it doesn't really matter to pay attention to what they are doing during most rounds. But obviously there are some builds that need to pay more attention. And you do need to have sort of your DPS check in mind for whether you can kill these guys, but actually their behavior during a specific arena is less important to pay attention to. Alright, then we've got the Tentacles. So the Tentacles are going to try to follow you, but maintain a spacing. These try to stand a little closer to you than the other things that maintain a spacing. I think they try to stand about 150 units away. And they place 2 slashes on the ground at diagonals between... at a diagonal angle from them to you on either side of you. So they'll never attack directly under you. If you remain perfectly motionless, the Tentacles cannot hurt you. But of course, obviously, other things can. So these guys are really interesting depending on what you're trying to do. They also have tons of health and are quite knockback resistant, so you can't really deal with them easily through pure damage. You do have to end up dodging them. I think that overall what the Tentacles are doing is, again, not that important because you can always just stand still to dodge them, but you do need to pay some attention to where they are on the map because if you run into a big cluster of them, it can be quite dangerous. The time that the Tentacles are actually the most dangerous is when you run into the elite that summons them, which we'll talk about once we get into the elites, of course, but during most waves, you don't really need to pay attention to what they're doing. I'm going to put them again in C tier, but I think that it is worth mentioning that you need to pay attention to where some clusters of these are so you don't run into them. Alright, next up, the Slugs, or according to the wiki, the Spawners. These are probably the enemy that kills me the most of any enemy. When I play the game, including elites, because of how it works when they start showing up on wave 14. There are certain characters that can't avoid breaking the slugs, and when they break, 3 of these little guys pop out of them, the little summons, and they will zip around the outside edges of the arena, firing fast-moving projectiles. If enough of the little summons stack up, then what does the wiki call those? The junkies. If enough of those stack up, then you are going to be in real trouble because it will just fill the map with projectiles. This is actually most pronounced for the Explorer class because there are just going to be more of them and they're harder to hunt down because the map is bigger. So the whole map will fill with projectiles, and Explorer really suffers on wave 14, so it's worth mentioning in particular that these are bad for Explorer, but these are just very dangerous for everyone, especially if you're a build that does indiscriminate damage, whether that be through elemental damage, engineering damage, explosive damage, or just long-ranged damage, piercing, bouncing, and so on. These guys are going to end up being quite dangerous. Overall, I think where the spawners are on the map is probably the most important thing to pay attention to in wave 14 and above. And so these guys are going to be S tier enemies the whole way through, not only in the wave in which they appear, but they're pretty much the most dangerous thing waves 14 through 20. Once the little junkies have spawned, so if you've broken one of the slugs, then you want to stand near, but not directly on the spawns. Because how this will work is you will break a slug, 3 red X's will spawn. If you stand directly on one of those red X's, I have actually given this information incorrectly in previous videos, but if you stand directly on one of those red X's, it just moves the enemy spawn to a random place elsewhere on the map, a new red X will appear and that enemy will appear elsewhere. And what you want is for them all to spawn and for you to immediately kill them, rather than them appearing elsewhere, because the whole thing that makes this enemy type dangerous is if a critical mass of the summons starts building up. Overall, I think the actual summons themselves, you do want to prioritize clearing them, but you don't need to care a ton about where they are, and there's just going to be so many of them that you can't track them individually. I do think they're worth spending quite a bit of attention on and putting them in A tier, just to pay attention to what they're doing. Alright, then we've got the last of the normal enemies to show up. This one starts showing up wave 16, so quite late in the game, and this is the buffer. The wiki also calls these buffers. These guys will just run directly away from you. They will continue to run away from you. They don't try to maintain a distance or anything like that. They'll just keep running. And they will periodically highlight an enemy in red, which gives it 150% more health, so 2.5 times as much health. And then 1.5 times its speed, and 1.25 times its damage. So it buffs its damage by 25% and speed by 50%. These fast, higher health, more damaging enemies are super dangerous, and even for very defensively oriented builds that have lots of health and armor and regen, the huge damage instances that you're going to be taking from these enemies overall are just sometimes too much to deal with if you let a number of these buffers stack up. For that reason, it's very important in these later waves, especially wave 19, I think it is, where the buffers and the rib cages really combine to become very dangerous, because a faster, more damaging rib cage is going to hit you for like 40 damage a pop, which will obviously be impossible to heal up very easily. You need to clear out the buffers before they can start stacking up buffs on rib cages or armored chargers, stuff with high base health, that will then chase you around and deal huge amounts of deterministic damage to you, as in damage that you can't avoid through outgoing attacks or through careful play. The rib cages will always catch you. The armored chargers are very hard to avoid. And so on. So overall, I think that these guys, when they start appearing, become extremely dangerous and are very much worth paying attention to. Finally, the last non-elite or boss enemy is the Lampri, or Leech. Lampri on the wiki. These only appear if you are the fisherman or if you buy bait in the previous shop, and it will spawn a few of them whenever that happens. You can choose when to spawn them, which is one thing that you have an advantage over these guys with, because you are able to decide whether or not the wave is too dangerous in order to spawn these enemies. Typically, what that means is that you just don't buy bait if you're going into an elite or horde wave, because you'll take a lot of damage off the start. Also, never combine buying bait with buying weird ghost, because you'll just get one shot off the start. It's very hard to avoid taking any damage when these spawn, so you really just need the defensive stats to survive their onslaught, and then once you've cleared them, you can go back to doing other stuff. Obviously, these are very dangerous enemies, but they do spawn right at the beginning of a wave, so nothing else will really be putting you in danger unless there's an elite on the map. Which means that even though you do have to spend some attention on them, you don't have to spend any focus on anything else, which sort of means their relative focus demand is lower than many of these other enemies. So for that reason, I'm actually going to put them in A tier, even though they are the only thing you're going to be focusing on most of the time when they're there. They're not taking your attention away from other important stuff at that point. How these guys work is that they have basically two behaviors combined. They'll follow you and charge at you, much like the chargers and rushers, but they will also fire two projectiles whenever they charge to either side of you, much like the tentacles. Together with the fact that they spawn in numbers, this means that it is very hard to avoid taking damage from them. But because you get to control when they spawn, and because they only spawn at the beginning of the wave, they are slightly less dangerous or worth paying attention to than the S tier enemies. Of course, the fishermen can have these randomly spawn throughout the wave, and for the fishermen, these are basically the only thing that's dangerous because of the fishermen's extremely high damage and income. By the time you start having these stack up, you should be way, way ahead of the economy curve compared to other classes. So while these are of special note for the fishermen, I think, again, you are not going to have to pay attention particularly to the individual ones that spawn later in the round, because you are mostly just focused on surviving the initial burst of them spawning at the beginning. That said, of course, the fisherman revolves entirely around managing your relationship with the baits and the lampreys, so it is, of course, going to need to pay attention to what they're doing. I think in order to do justice to the elites, I'm going to save these for a second video. I am going to combine these into the tier list, but then I will also later on be doing a video where we go over video footage of every elite and talk about how to fight them and good strategies for fighting each of them. So look forward both to a future tier list and to good fights, ways to fight these elites. It would also be extremely helpful to me if you are happening to watch any of my Brotato videos in future or in the past and see a fight against one of these elites that you think demonstrates well sort of how to fight it. Flag that for me, and that will help me a ton find good footage for that video. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed part 1, it turns out, of the Brotato enemies tier list. We are going over, of course, every enemy and ranking how much attention we have to pay to them. Let me know what you think, both of this concept for a video and this format, and I hope that you enjoyed. As always, if you did, do leave a comment and like the video. Both of those things help a ton with the algorithm, and you can subscribe to my channel for more strategy guides and other strategy game content. Cheers, my friends. I'll catch you next time.